Welcome to a Rice University digital media production. For more information about us, please visit our website at www.rice.edu.
Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you all to this continuation in our series on the power of ideas. I know a number of you have been following this series, and I've been very gratified by the number of people who have indicated that they really like the format of the 5-minute lecture. I'm Susan McIntosh. I'm the director of Scientia. And this provides a format for us that does several of the things that are part of the mission of Scientia, which is to bring people together from across the campus and expose other faculty and students, all members of our community, to the work and the ideas that are the lifeblood of our faculty here. The only difficulty I am given to understand with a 5-minute talk is that it actually takes a lot of work to craft a very short talk. So we are all the more grateful to the 4 exceptional lecturers today who have agreed to take on that challenge and develop an idea and present it to you powerfully and persuasively in 5 minutes. Because we are going for brevity and because we want to get you all out interacting at the reception afterwards, my introductions will be very brief, and there will be no question and answer period afterwards. Take your questions out to the reception, please. Join us in some food and talk among yourselves and come up and ask the speakers if you have questions. So, with that said, I would invite our first speaker, Stephen J. Cox, Professor of Computational and Applied Mathematics, to come up, and he's speaking on atoms of thought.
Thank you, Susan. Can you hear me? Yeah? When Scientia last brought us together, we learned from Jim Pomerantz that the brain is not the reliable reporter of the outside world. Freud taught us that the brain is not a reliable reporter of the inside world either. Introspection does not reveal the unconscious. Put another way, we may perceive and even imagine the face of a friend, but we cannot perceive our percept. Even more simply, when asked to add 5 to 3, I challenge you to identify the thought that brought you to 8. But the inside is there nonetheless, and its contemplation does give us a sense that inside is different from anything outside. And this difference has led even our greatest minds to entertain dualism. For the dualist, in the words of Donald Hebl, the mind is an immaterial agent that obtains sensory information from the brain and in turn acts on the brain to control the musculature and thus determine what the body does. In short, the body is inhabited by a controlling spirit. With Hebl, I find this fundamentally objectionable because it removes biological problems from examination. The necessary working assumption must be materialism, no matter what one's personal belief. The real argument for the existence of a separate mind is a negative one, that no alternative biological explanation of mental phenomena can be satisfactory. To be sure that this is so, and to convince others, the biological possibilities must be fully explored, including those that we've not yet thought of, so that they can be shown to be inadequate. But this will not happen if one has no interest in biological questions and sets out fully committed to the hypothesis of a separate mind. To be a good dualist, first think and experiment like a materialist. Hebl himself produced a biological explanation that has not been shown to be inadequate. I build this theory from William James, who first said that there are no atoms of experience, no sensation without association, and Freud, who hypothesized that these associations were expressed in altered synaptic weights between neurons. Hebl in 1949 coupled this synaptic plasticity with the recently discovered closed loops of Laurent Deneau and arrived at a notion of cell assembly. Hebl presumed that these loops abound at birth and are then tuned up by experience. When a stimulus is impressed on the senses, Some loops receive more input than others and so reverberate more intensely. After a number of such presentations, the connections within the most active group of cells are strengthened to such an extent that partial input, or even remote associations, subsequently activate the whole assembly. Hebl postulated that when an assembly fires as a result of sensory input, its activity represents the perception of the stimulus. When it fires in the absence of the corresponding sensory input, it represents the concept of the stimulus. It is in this sense that cell assemblies are the atoms of thought. When a sequence of stimuli recur frequently, Hebl postulated that the aroused assemblies would become associated with each other and result in what he called phase sequences. Thinking is then the sequential activation of cell assemblies. For example, our triangle has three sides, A, B, and C. As the integration of A, B, and C proceeds, repeated fixation on the three sides of the triangle, repeated fixation on the three sides of the triangle, and repeated fixation on the three sides of the triangle slowly establishes three diffuse, irregular cell assemblies, each of which is capable of acting momentarily as a closed system. So where does T come from? The stability of a perception is not in a single persistent pattern of cerebral activity, but in the tendency of the phases of an irregular cycle to recur at short intervals. For example, ABC, BAC, AB. When the superassembly T for a triangle emerges, the evidence indicates that its activity intervenes between the activities of the subordinate assemblies. Your mind is always in motion. You go A, B, T, ACT, CTB. You're not fixated on triangle, 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 on forever. The evidence. Such a sequence may involve as few as 100 cells, and so may forever be impossible to detect among the brain's 100 billion cells. There is, however, clear evidence of assemblies breaking into subordinate assemblies when an individual is constrained to fixate on a stabilized image. More precisely, our eyes are in constant motion as we assemble an image. So I'm placing a picture on the end of a tube glued to a contact lens affixed to the eye. The observer reports a highly ordered disintegration of the image. The triangle disintegrates into a pair of edges, into a single edge, into nothing. The necrocube, you can imagine, disintegrates into a pair of faces and then to a single face and then down into a pair of edges and an edge and nothing. You can maybe guess where H upon B gives birth to H and then B and then 3 and 4 and then nothing. Beer disintegrates into peer and peep and BEE and then BE and then nothing. Subsequent work has found changes in the alpha band and visual cortex as the image is disintegrating, so we kind of know where to look. At present, experimentalists are working on statistical methods to detect cell assemblies from multi-electrode arrays. These are small beds of nails pressed onto the cortex. And theoreticians, like myself, are using graph theory to probe the nature of networks that can support cell assemblies and so support thought. The latter indeed relies on a beautiful mathematical definition of cell assembly, but my time is up, so I hope I've at least scratched your surface.
Thank you so much, Steve. Our next speaker is Michelle Hebl, Professor of Psychology and Management, speaking on the topic Discriminated Against.
Thank you very much. I thought I had an excuse because I have something akin to bronchitis, but I learned that Stephen has pneumonia, so he trumped me. So bear with me as I make my way through this. Okay. So this is the kind of talk I like. There's no questions. And I didn't sign that form, that waiver, until after I see how it goes. So it's beautiful. I often find myself asking the question, have I been discriminated against? And maybe you have in your life too. And I'm going to start with just a couple anecdotes that tell you a little bit about my ideas and how I got to study the things that I studied. So the first one is that I now have an 8, a 6, and a 4-year-old, and I'm acutely aware of my own childhood and 3rd and 4th grade, in particular in 3rd grade. I was very, very good friends with this girl, and we were very popular. And kids are mean. And something happened, we got in a fight, and in 3rd grade I told everybody that they should not like her. And it was great because they all listened to me and everybody loved me and they didn't like her. So it was a nice year for me. I had a lot of friends. And in 4th grade, something happened. My life kind of went tipsy-turvy or topsy-turvy or whatever, and she reclaimed power and she said, now nobody should like her. And so for my whole 4th grade, nobody liked me. I was the cooties. I had no friends. There was a person who came from England, and she moved in halfway through the term, and she wanted to befriend me. And I said, you can't talk to me. If you talk to me, nobody's going to like you. And she said, I can talk to whomever I like. Okay, that was a moment that crystallized. Some of our earliest moments are those moments that I hear are going to stay with us longest. I believe that. Now I'm going to flash forward, and I'm going to tell you that I'm going to make an disclosure. I get cold sores. How many of you get cold sores? Yeah, you don't want to admit it because this is a horrible thing. And I used to think I was allergic to pictures because I would get them only when the picture was being taken for a class. And so I'd have this big old cold sore. And it's herpes simplex 1, and somebody kissed me with it, and a lot of us are carriers, but it was so nasty, and it's really awful. And I'd be talking to somebody, and I would have this herpes on my lip and cold sore, and I'd see them, and I'd think, you're looking at my lip. You're looking at my lip. I know it looks awful. You're looking at my lip. And I would just want to say to them, look, I have a cold sore. It's really awful, and I know it looks ugly. And that's what I'd do all the time. And then it made me feel better because I had disclosed, I had acknowledged, and I had moved on. I know you're going, where is this lady going? Okay, third story is I went to Smith College. I was a small Midwestern girl. I did something that no other Wisconsin girl has done. No other small town girl in the town of Partyville, Wisconsin has ever done. I went to Smith College. And when I went there, I was like, holy shit. Sorry. There were activists everywhere, and they were getting on buses and going to all sorts of, stand-ins, sit-ins, whatever, in Washington, D.C. And then I did something that no other Smithy has done in recorded history, and that's I went to graduate school, sight unseen, to Texas A&M. Okay. So when I was trying to get a place to rent, somebody in College Station said to me, "You's not from around these parts, are you?" And I was like, oh my God, I'm like a white Midwestern girl. What's the problem, And they said, you're not a Yankee, you're not a Hook 'em Horns, you're not a Aggie, you're not a Yankee, or a UT, you're a Yankee. Sorry, and I really got that. You can see I really am a Yankee, okay? So those three experiences are just some of the experiences that made me start thinking about discrimination and what it's like to be discriminated against. And that's really what I do my research on, is I look at discrimination and how people experience discrimination, whether it's being ostracized because your friends tell you shouldn't like somebody, because you have something on your lip, because you're from a different background, whatever it is. That's what I do my research on, and it's those experiential situations that led me to this research. Now, the type of research that I do focuses on formal versus interpersonal discrimination. And formal discrimination is the discrimination that is something that that laws are made to prevent. So I can't say to you, I don't like you because of your race. I don't like you because of your gender. And formal discrimination is something that is protected by most laws. There are some groups that are not protected yet, and we hope they will get protected soon enough with laws such as ENDA. What my research focuses on is another type of discrimination, and that's interpersonal discrimination. So if you were all right now to think about a person you don't like really quickly, right now. If you don't have one, I can give you a couple extras. And you think about that person, and that person is right in front of you. What does your face do? What do you try to do when that person interacts with you? And that's essentially what my research looks at. It looks at that tiny interpersonal, the smiling less, the less eye contact, the trying to terminate the interaction, and trying to reduce that interaction so that you no longer have to be around that person. So that's my experiences. I focused on, first of all, the formal discrimination and then the interpersonal discrimination. And that interpersonal discrimination, my research shows, is just as important, if not more important, than the formal discrimination, because the interpersonal discrimination constantly leaves people asking, am I being discriminated against? Thank you.
And our next speaker is Matthias Henze, the Watt J. and Lily G. Jackson Professor in Biblical Studies, speaking on Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the Unfinished Ethics.
Thank you. Protestant theology of the 20th century would have looked rather different, with even more intellectual depth and perhaps some color, had Adolf Hitler not decided as one of his last acts to have those assassinated who had tried to assassinate him. Among them Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a brilliant intellectual and Lutheran theologian, who was hanged on April 9th, 1945, some 2 weeks before the concentration camp where he was held was liberated. Bonhoeffer was able to finish only some of his work, yet his writing soon had enormous influence on post-war Germans, including myself. I was born 20 years after the war. My father, born in 1923, was drafted, sent to the Eastern Front, was wounded, pulled back, healed, and then was sent to the Western Front, where the Americans caught him. Later, he would refer to this as his second birth. He was clothed, fed, and sent immediately home after the war. I was born 20 years later, yet the war was everywhere, always. It was in our house, it was in our town, which the British had flattened in a war frenzy, and it was certainly there when we traveled abroad. It was in that context that, as a teenager, I first came across Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the theologian who had joined the resistance. In a bookstore, I found his Unfinished Ethics, written in between 1940 and 1943, and so I began to read, quote, "The knowledge of good and evil seems to be the aim of all ethical reflection. The first task of a Christian ethics is to invalidate this knowledge. In launching this attack on the underlying assumptions of all other ethics, Christian ethics stands so completely alone that it becomes questionable whether there is any purpose in speaking of Christian ethics at all," unquote. I found this rather stunning. The point of a Christian ethics is to invalidate the knowledge of good and evil, and this from a man who spent the last years of his life fighting what arguably was evil in its ugliest form. Bonhoeffer gets this idea from Scripture, the book of Genesis. It was through an act of transgression, by eating the fruit in the garden, that Adam and Eve gained knowledge of good and evil and, at the same time, were alienated from God. For Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the acquisition of this knowledge means a falling away from the origin of human existence and making oneself the origin of all ethical judgment. And precisely therein lies the problem. This amounts to a self-justification that is based on one's own ethical judgment. It doesn't take much to figure out what the Nazis did not like about this. After all, they were not exactly shy to draw the line between good and evil, to act on it, and to feel fully justified in doing so. There's something paradoxical here. How can the theologian who claims that it is the task of Christian ethics to invalidate the knowledge of good and evil have given his own life to fight the evil that was Nazi Germany? The answer comes a little later in his ethics with what Bonhoeffer calls the biblical concept of doing. The only way to overcome the divide between humankind and our Creator, to undo Adam's transgression, as it were, is by doing the will of God. Only in doing can there be submission to the will of God, writes Bonhoeffer. In doing God's will, man renounces every right and every justification of his own, unquote. One could object, of course, that you cannot act or do without knowing what to do. In other words, we first need to know the will of God before we can act. The point, however, is this. For Bonhoeffer, humans can never be the final arbitrators of good and evil. This is reserved for God alone. The horrors of World War II forced Bonhoeffer to confront one of the most basic features of our existence, our ultimate inability for ethical certainty. The same insight has led others to cynicism and nihilism, but not Bonhoeffer. Through meditation, prayer, and humility, he strove to find the will of God and to live by it. The limits of ethical certainty did not lead him to apathy, but to action. Action based on the paradox, still with us today, that even though we can never be certain about good and evil, we are still called in humility to do good and to oppose evil. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Matthias. And our last speaker is Janet Braam, Chair and Professor of Biochemistry and Cell Biology, on the topic Life is Incredible.
Thank you. It's rather surprising to me that I'm a biologist, since as long as I can remember, I've had this defect. It's genetic. My father gave it to me. You might know it as somebody having an inability to see blood, to face the sight of blood. But for me, I don't need to see blood. I can pass out from a story about somebody in pain. The best explanation I have for this behavior is that I overreact to the concept of mortality. I cannot reconcile who I feel I am with the biological truth of what I really am, just a collection of cells. And when I'm forced to face that reality, I panic, I pass out cold. Given this situation, you would think that I would stay as far away from biology as possible. But somehow, I just can't look away. I find myself completely fascinated that any of it works. Evolution is a powerful force with amazing consequences. So here I am, a biologist. Perhaps knowing what you do about me now, you won't be totally surprised to learn that I'm a plant biologist. Plants don't often get the respect they deserve. They don't bleed, they don't cry out in pain, thank goodness. But they clearly demonstrate the power of living cells. So today I'm going to tell you 3 short stories about plants that I hope will make you peer a little bit closer at the trees as you walk by, have a little bit more respect for the grass that you step on, and wonder a bit about the broccoli on your dinner plate. First, plants can feel when you touch them, or when the wind blows, or perhaps when an insect lands on a leaf. Plants appear passive, but we now know that in response to a simple touch stimulation, plants turn on genes, synthesize hormones, undergo cellular changes to alter their development. Reach out, touch a plant. It feels it. Second, plants have an internal clock. Like humans, plants use the circadian clock to tell time. Plants sense the daily cycles of light and darkness to be able to keep track of time. This clock enables plants to predict enemy behavior. Plants make anti-insect chemicals at the times of day that insects are most likely to feed. That way, when attacked, the plants are ready with nasty chemicals that make the insects sick. This is one way that plants, which are unable to run away, defend themselves against attack. So I've told you that plants sense touch, and plants can tell time. My third story hits a little closer to home. Chemicals similar to the ones that make insects sick when our model plant is fending off insects are also found in some of the foods we eat. Cabbage and broccoli have such chemicals, which give them some of their distinctive tastes. However, in addition, those chemicals are among the most potent natural anti-cancer compounds known. That's why you're told to eat cabbage and broccoli. So we recently wondered whether these chemicals accumulate in our vegetables only at certain times of day, like they do in our model plant fending off insects. So if I eat my cabbage at noon, do I get more of that anti-cancer benefit than if I eat my cabbage in the evening? Well, perhaps. To appreciate this idea, I need to tell you something about fruits and vegetables. So yes, the cabbage is ripped off from its roots when harvested, and the carrot is dug up from the soil. But plants are different from you and me. Plants are built in modules, and so the individual parts, like the leaves and the stems and the roots, can remain very much alive long after being removed from the whole plant. So we wondered if fruits and vegetables behave like our favorite lab plant, even long after being harvested. We bought cabbage and other produce from the grocery store and exposed them to light and darkness cycles to entrain their clock and measured the anti-cancer chemicals. And indeed, we found that we could reset the clock of these post-harvest vegetables, and the levels of the anti-cancer chemicals vary dependent on time of day. Who knew? After all these years of looking closer at biology, at life, I still need to avoid emergency rooms and graphic news stories to maintain consciousness. I still live my life largely in denial that my life is dependent upon the delicate, fascinating, and improbable behaviors of cells. I'm still in awe that it all works. And every day, as a biologist, I get to discover a little bit more about why life is so incredible. Thank you.
I want to thank all four speakers. I think every single one of them has given us very powerful autobiographical insights into not only what they do, but why they do it and what some of the early influences were that pushed them in particular directions. And this was all very powerful today. So thank you all for doing this. I want to thank you all for coming and hope that you will also join us on March 12th when our next colloquium will be. And right now, I'll invite you out to the reception. Thank you all so much.
This program is protected by copyright and may not be redistributed in whole or in part without the express written consent of Rice University Digital Media Services.